Hello everyone, today we talk about Habsburgic history. I don't know how far I'll be going with this, but essentially I'm planning a series that I will in fact carry out in chronological order about Habsburgic history from essentially the beginning of the 30 Years' War to the Congress of Vienna. I realized that, of course, as a medievalist, talking about the Habsburgs is mostly something that, I do for personal reasons, mostly because I studied a bit of the 13th century Habsburgic history, mostly. As you know, I also wrote something about the Battle of Markfeld and so on, so I got passion about that time, which is usually not discussed very much, and you gotta understand that because I think the very early Habsburgs are somehow overlooked, like the power that the monarchy had under Rudolf and Albert especially is somehow underappreciated, not just in popular culture, but as a medievalist I can say in the broader European balance of the time. Naturally, there were things that went wrong for them, like the defeats against the Wittelsbachs, etc. But we will talk about that more in depth at some point for the medieval history series. If anything, I realized now that I also got habituated to make a bit more dedicated videos I would call specials before, but now are becoming somehow regular. Albeit I still do follow the cycle, and I just metaphysically get out of it and provide with this other kind of external stuff. But it's a sign, of course, that Schwerpunkt is expanding, and of course I've noticed, not just because I like Habsburgic history, for many reasons that I will explain partly now. I haven't really talked about them that much, right? And this is true for many topics on Schwerpunkt, that you may think, well, he doesn't talk about that because he actually knows less about it or doesn't like it or similar things, right? Just he talks about things he knows best, or that he cares more about. This is not entirely true, right? Of course, this is true to some extent for certain topics that are somehow recurrent, certain tangents I take with my rambles every once in a while, but indeed it's not true for Habsburgic history. That deserves much greater consideration. In fact, for a huge number of reasons that I will not, however, discuss in this video. In this video, I really want to talk about the early Habsburgs, right, saying from, not even the earliest, because there is all a history before Rudolf, right, but as far as the German kingship, and also the Roman one, that's where most of the story begins, and of course Charles V arriving at the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the modern era, and obviously the apex of Habsburgic power, at least as far as the family, the dynasty was concerned, right? Because at the end of the day, yes, we talk about the Habsburgic Empire, Spain, all the colonies, etc. But this was naturally just a dynastic collection, right, of inheritance rights, not really a unitary empire, right? And even though the interests of the various branches of the family somehow converged, for example, against France, the Ottomans, the Protestants, etc., still the difficulties, first of all, to manage the system altogether were enormous, but also the ones of the single houses, especially the German and the Austrian one, were quite complicated, right? That's also the reason why Charles V shifted fundamentally the greater power towards Spain, and to which also the Netherlands were entrusted. So all things that, of course, I will in part discuss today, which may sound redundant for the Habsburg lovers, but that I think it's good, just like an introduction for the 17th and the 18th century on which I will concentrate the most. Why this chronological scanning? Because I think that what happened in those later centuries is, admittedly, I should talk about the 19th as well, but I don't make too much 19th century history, as it requires an enormous background that I have to provide. In general, I think either I start making modern contemporary history sort of manualistic lessons, or I can't quite simply enter in that environment unless it's just something like strictly military in nature, etc. I've already done it also recently. But of course, the importance of the Habsburgic dynasty rests not, let's say, in this sort of meeting ground between so many different elements that different historians approach from different, from different points of view. Some stress, especially this sort of, starting mostly from a modernistic or contemporary perspective, not focusing so much on traditional history, especially the medieval empire, etc. They want to stress the diversity of the Habsburgic Empire from, the most the most compact Western national monarchies. Some stress the ethnic side of the story, because look at all these peoples that functioned at least in some way together, and look at what happened later. And there's a lot of that going on nowadays, stressing that all things, especially connected to World War I, mostly revolving around actually the German Empire rather than the Austro-Hungarian one, that want to reevaluate certain aspects, but not quite nailing the point of why these empires fell in the first place, especially because they have no idea what, in fact, the imperial Catholic tradition was really about, what the Romanity of the empire was really about, and what, in this sense, the Habsburgs were identifying with for the most obvious leadership role that prestigious position, office entailed in the first place. So that with my channel I go pretty far back in times as far as the idea of the fall of man and that this gradual degeneration of mankind. And so, especially as a medievalist looking at anything modern or contemporary, even the Habsburgic monarchy, I have some perplexities. Generally speaking, I'm not so thrilled. Everything becomes ever more sad, right, in the history of humanity in many ways. But that's exactly what, at least in relative terms, the Habsburgs tend to embody, at least the opposite of, right? And in fact, that sense of belief that we've mostly been told, well, it was actually a good thing, right? It was a good thing that, the Reformation happened, and that, universal empire fragmented. And never mind that in the 16th century, people thought the world was ending. This was the greatest disaster they could envisage. That in comparison, the discovery of the Americas was essentially an irrelevant thing. We have to think this was the Renaissance. Everything was so cool. There was this great advancement of man, etc. The 30 Years' War, this was a step further, or, in a time in which, let's say, everybody began to decide what confession they could choose, and this is a positive thing. It opened to international laws, to the sort of, without seeing, first of all, the millions of people that, and that were killed in the process, and not telling you why those wars were being fought in the first place, for real. Because this is not just something you can connect to, say, there was a monolithic bloc or state that functioned all in the same way, so if it lost, it would lose everything. This was against, and especially in the case of the empire, a multitude of forces that were understanding the importance instead of the universal empire. But that's a positive thing. This is it's sort of tragic, but everything's fine. And the secularization, the abolition of the same Holy Roman Empire. Well, but we had Napoleon. Come on, everything was better afterwards, was true modernity or even contemporaneity and whatever. And by the way, now I'm being, somehow unserious, but I made videos explaining the duality of this issue, because the point I wanna make is not that, this conceptually was a tragedy, right? And we have been told that this was not the case, right? Things somehow improved in the essential quality of mankind in the process. But I also, of course, stress the fact that those who were in charge of the older institutions, of the ancien regime, etc., had become, on the basis of of traditional definition, incapable of handling that. In tradition, there is only one rule. If you fail, it's your fault, point, because you must be the one who rules. So if somebody destroys you, it's your fault, right? It's not just you staying there and somebody stabbing you accidentally. You had to not be stabbed in the first place, right? Fighting, or hopefully even just, convincing the other person that would have not been a good thing to take you out. And so, of course, everything, right? Even what we consider, there's no true, there's no full antithesis between what we call modernity, that is a bit of an invention, and tradition, right? Most of what we intend as modernity, and that succeeded to some further degree, is still a part of tradition surviving, right? Depleted, somehow ever more disoriented and whatever, but just because without tradition can't be any achievement in there. So we tend to confuse, to categorize, to sectorialize, to absolutize, etc. Just like saying, I made that video about tradition and modernity, I made the video about the war of the Fifth Coalition, as far as the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars were concerned, and you perfectly know that, of course, in Napoleon's achievements, there was a greatness was recognized as divine sent by the same, most conservative, traditionalist, authoritarian powers of the time, because that's what they believed in. And so you can't quite say, okay, well, everything that happened on the other side was just negative, right? There was, this, the figure of Napoleon, but in general, the system that had produced him, something that worked, that was the step further, that was more powerful, just with more reckless drivers at the head of that, not much because of national identity, whatever, that is definitely not as important as the universal one in tradition, but because people were essentially forgetting what the entire deal of existence really was, right? There is a good enlightenment, there is a very bad enlightenment, and they were essentially saying at some point antithetic things. So never commit the mistake of saying, oh, well, I just buy, I support the Habsburgs, so everything the Habsburgs, I like them, right? So I have to support them in everything, just because it's my favorite, and the rest must be just negative thing. Most people reason like this for everything, right? Especially concerning their own country. And that's, in fact, the greatest indicator of complete fall from any trace of tradition, as well as human dignity, for that matter. And they lost already everything, right? They're just dissolving into the shadows, as most people have been doing evidently in the last millennia. And this is, in many ways, can be read as a huge tragedy. But you got to understand also what is still alive within it. Thus, I think that studying Habsburgic history in those crucial centuries can be really, really, really interesting. As you understand, I owe much of my education, let's put it this way, to Mitteleuropa in general, and say Central European culture in a broader sense. If you pick the same von Clausewitz, if you look at some bias that they evidently have towards a bit more the central, broadly meant, but not just Central European in a strictly geographical sense, but in a bit that world that was maybe going a bit slower, not at the slowest, because it was essentially managing to handle both modernity and tradition to some satisfactory, sometimes equilibristic, there is no doubt, degree. But so the Habsburgs are somehow embodying this to the great extent. I could tell you that one of the reasons why I love Habsburgic history is because I love, of course, the places, Vienna, the various. I will tell you some anecdotes later. The fact that part of my ancestors were proud Habsburgic subjects, etc. But you also know that when it comes to my historical criticism, I fundamentally don't care. Like, I am here because I want to be as objective as I can, because I'm challenging you as much as I challenge myself talking about these things, and therefore I think it can be really, really interesting and filling a void that is evidently left out when we have to talk about, again, this great thing of the Habsburgic monarchy that everybody knows of, but that when it gets to the details, somehow even the same peoples that lived under it, the universal meaning of the empire, the general international relations, well, this is at least something which is lamented at the beginning of every book that I've ever read on the topic from the Anglosphere. It says people do not know, at least in those words, but I can actually say it as a European, pretty much about every European, including the ones that lived under the Habsburgic monarchy. Right? Don't think that you ask this thing to anyone there, and you actually get that they have the palest idea of what you're talking about. We do not live in this world anymore. Like, the West once was the only place in which people knew something, or at least those who were in charge did. Then today, nobody in the world does anything about their own country anywhere, right? Not even remote. Again, in the West, we still have the upper hand, definitely, on these matters. But this is part of the failure of the same Habsburgic empire in itself, as much as a failure of ourselves, right? Having had this thing and not really even realizing this, if not watching, sort of cheesy movies about, sissy and, Viennese dances. I liked the setting. I liked, the story there. I frequent the places, but also for that sort of taste. But I, of course, look at lots of other things that I think were the actual deal of this this polity, and that really deserve to be explained through a series that I count time allowing and my survival allowing, of course, to take to a fair length, right? So today we talk really about the beginnings. Again, I will say things that are probably unknown to anyone, but I will try also to add some sort of reflection to that, so that can take a bit more of dimension, right? There is, for example, an interesting quote from a 19th century. This was called Austro-Slavist, right? He was actually a Pan-Slavist, František Palaski. He was a Czech publicist who stated that if the Habsburg monarchy hadn't existed, it would have had to be created, right? His position was actually pretty weird, because he, as a Slavic subject of the Habsburgic Empire, here we see that the virus of nationalism had already been pouring in, and of course after Napoleon, even the formerly victorious Habsburgs were not the same anymore. If anything, the Holy Roman Empire did not exist anymore, so it was a completely different picture. And of course, mass culture, the Fourth Estate, was growing to this pretty strange ideas. In the case of Pulaski, to the sense that it was convenient to be under the Habsburgic monarchy from a Pan-Slavist point of view, because paradoxically, even though these peoples were under effectively a sort of German hegemony, because at the end of the day, the Austrians ruled over the Czechs at that point. The institutional space that the monarchy left was fundamentally a good instrument that could be used by the Slavs living in the empire to sort of coalesce, to make a single front, and to win some other power. This is not so. This is a bit leitmotif also later, after 1867, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire was created de facto, right, with the rising of the Hungarians, if anything, that were pretty dramatically oppressive against the Slavs. For that matter, they just wanted to essentially seize power, and of course things were going rapidly downhill there until World War I. There are really lots of different paths this could be taken. So I promise I will talk more about the 19th century. I made a video, for example, about how the modern Ukrainian national identity was de facto created within the Habsburgic Empire, right? Of course, there was something about that in the Russian Palatinate and so on, but the space where most of the contemporary national identity flourished from a political point of view was within the Habsburgic institutions, for reasons again that I explained there. So it's an incredibly complex and complicated history, and again, we will not see much of all of it. But the one of the previous century definitely will be eloquent regarding that. So some historians say, well, the Habsburgic monarchy was created de facto at the beginning of the early modern period, without considering the enormous legacy that the Habsburgs were at least claiming straight from essentially the end of the Interregnum, and so directly from the Hohenstaufen, as a matter of fact, right? Rudolf of Habsburg had been, a loyal of Frederick II, had descended in Italy when Conradin was marching towards, right, the kingdom of Sicily. Rudolf's brother died in battle against the Lombard League, so we're talking about very important, very central figures, let's say, in an actual location, even though, as you know, Rudolf was known as the little Count because he didn't have yet too much power. It's unironic that the Hohenstaufen had emerged a bit like in the same way, supporting the fading Franconian power, as you know. The Habsburgs were also actually a much more noble lineage than in their origins than other even royal dynasties, such as the imperial ones. For genealogically speaking, just we miss one ring of the chain to actually trace back, so one single guy in the sequence, to trace back the Habsburgs directly and certainly to the Romano-Burgundian aristocracy, right? So these were these ancients of blood and this noble of blood from a very long time. So this is another characteristic of the Habsburgs, that they transcend, just like any dynasty in the imperial Catholic tradition, any kind of specific, say, categorical national frame, right? They came from the heart and blood of Europe, right? In places at the crossroads between, in fact, Gaul, Germany, Italy. Places that are a bit the same ones, that when we look definitely at the most important events revolving around the empire and from ancient to medieval times and beyond, evidently are the most crucial, the most important. It is true, of course, that the Habsburgs in late medieval times, and this is the reason why I didn't talk so much about them. I made a video about the Duchy of Austria, but I talked about the Habsburgs mostly, of course, from the modern era, right? Were not brutally important, right? I will say that much. Again, they were somehow more important in late 13th, in the early 14th century than they were, say, in the late 14th and in the early 15th, right? And it is true that much, essentially, of Habsburgic power was founded essentially under Frederick, with the union of the Albertian, the reunion of the Albertian and Leopoldian line, because they had basically, as we saw from the videos from the regional historical region series, basically suffered the same fate of so many dynasties in the 14th century crisis that simply split, right, dynastically, the Albertinian line and the Leopoldian line. So you have Frederick III that is somehow overlooked, but sort of conceived a bit as an idler, but actually operated well. Mostly Maximilian the First is the real maker of what we know as, at least as the Habsburg monarchy par excellence, as we will see today, mostly because of the very famous matrimonial policy, and we can say tradition, of the Habsburgic house that would somehow define it throughout the centuries in a very successful way, because it's thanks to these dynastic connections that this German, at that point southeastern German dynasty, even though they emerged from essentially from Swabia, ancestrally became that real European power that we know of, right? So our story of the Habsburgs will be about, of course, mostly Germany, right? Throughout the early modern age, we will not focus on the Spanish branch. We can do it in other videos, but this series will be dedicated to the Austrian Habsburgs, right? So just to specify, the dynastic aspect is important to emphasize because it's also the key to the understanding of what traditional government was fundamentally about, right? Again, if you study history from a modernistic perspective, you realize that the main deal is the sense that it was a state, right? And so something that even in pre-Vespalian times, you tend to think like a single country with a single confession, with a single flag, with a single language, with a neatly defined sort of political territorial control. This wasn't the case, right? So the Habsburgic monarchy, in a way, exasperates the level of somehow complexion, the amount of, in fact, of different peoples and cultures and languages, traditions, and so on. But don't think that even more compact countries like England, France, or Spain, that as the Western European monarchies essentially were the ones that since from the Middle Ages had evolved towards a more unitary direction, were that far, right, from that model, nor that at the time anyone actually believed in teleological ways like this kingdoms would evolve as monolithic states of some sort. The idea was still that there were freemen that had to accept a primus inter pares as ruler. Of course, especially at the end of the Middle Ages, this was not quite the case, because at least the aristocracy was by that point crystallizing throughout the Ancien regime that would last until 1792 or 1918, as far as, in fact, depending on which place you want to look at, right? And so I say this as a warning, because you will find on certain history books the sense that the sort of geopolitical factor of especially of literally territorial continuity, speaking especially of the Western European monarchies, had to do with a sort of immediate consequence of political, cultural, linguistical homogeneity. This is not really the case, right? It is obvious that, say, places like, well, it's not so obvious. In fact, I was making the example of England, but thinking, of course, of the broader Britain, and those were three kingdoms, The same goes for the same Spain, that, yes, has a precocious dynastic union that has also a lot to do with, of course, the Habsburgic marriage, at least just in the following generation, but technically within the same Spain, Castile, Aragon, we're still separated. We're still different crowns. They just were worn by the same ruler, right? But they were in fact separated. So if you are not acquainted with that kind of mentality, well, just know that that's the minimum you have to make the effort to picture continuously throughout all this content, because it's the only way they actually believed things were happening. It is true that there were countries that had a more precocious unitary mindset, that had also different sort of monarchic institutions. Think about the English reliance on more like the parliamentary, let's say, provocation, right, of the monarch, as opposed to France, that instead established institutionally, juridically, a sense that the king was conferred a substantially large amount of power, also that could at some point create some laws, as opposed to simply protecting others of the people. So that's the reason why I made at this point thousands of videos about medieval history, because looking at the story of all these various countries separately and just in comparison can really help understanding better how the system worked. The situation in the Holy Roman Empire was even more exasperated, right? While Italy had something like 30 states, Germany had 300, right? Which is that bad as it sounds, except that, of course, there were more unitary countries that had somehow not managed, say, namely unitary countries, especially Central European ones, with the exception of Germany, it was that sort of puzzled, fragmented. But if you take the great monarchies of Hungary, of Poland, the same Bohemia, you realize that these were in part also very machinous, very somehow privatized to the point of very difficult governability, so that Germany in that sense was, for example, more advanced what existed eastward. And there are different rhythms of expansion. The same Scandinavian monarchies, for example, during the Middle Ages had just, even if more unitary compared to Germany, had suffered a substantial German influence, when not actual domination, with some actual mercenary, say, certain troops that were even just taking control locally, etc. So this must be understood also as, federalism in institutions that in Germany, in spite of the disaster of the failure of the national monarchy in the 13th century, had been at least ingraining, on that, say, with that physiognomy, so that still today Germany is a federation, and the thing existed also before the failed attempt of power concentration during the High Middle Ages from the side of the monarchy. So every country dealt essentially with this stuff in different ways. You have, the Italian city-states that evolved into some sort of regional dimensions, swallowing the others. So every situation is somehow different, and the Habsburgic one is somehow delicate. Today we will not talk about the various reforms of the Reichskammergericht, or all these, various. I will make some videos about properly medieval and modern law to explain better how the systems concretely worked, how they were at least administered, and what also the political bargain was there, right? But the idea is that, and in fact, the German background is fascinating, because ideally, this country was unitary, right? It was a kingdom of Germany proper. It was different, for example, from the one of Bohemia, even though the latter had been fundamentally absorbed by the former. That's actually the only exception in a hegemonic sense, right? Germany as political, military, and cultural power during the Middle Ages had somehow heavily impacted Poland, Hungary, but they had remained as separated kingdoms, right? There was a great deal of interest, especially towards the end of the Middle Ages, towards Italian money and exploiting especially the imperial institutions to confer feudal titles to certain, think about the Visconti, the Milanese, etc., to be, in fact, vassals of the emperor, having nobiliar titles in exchange for actual financing. Many of the, in fact, so-called Roman expeditions for actually getting crowned by emperor by the papacy was essentially the only way to achieve so. Even though it would die out in the modern age, it was all a matter of still attempting that universal sort of imperial revival that the Germans had monopolized to, in that sense, a national level. That is interesting. The sense, of course, that the Germans were now also, as you know, during the 14th century, is properly the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation added as a formal title. Naturally, nation is intended in the Latin way, so that Germany was dramatically different in linguistic, cultural variety. There was a traumatically violent hatred from, say, the north to the south, and that paranoia was the one that had effectively caused the fall of the national monarchy, or, say, the abortion of it, to say better. And that essentially now whoever was Holy Roman Emperor was trying to bargain mostly at the level of elite. Right, you see that in Central Europe, we have seen it this often. Germany, Hungary, Poland, Bohemia, etc., tended to, as elective monarchies, right, very differently from, again, what we've seen in Western Europe, tended to, let's say, favor much more than in other countries that had already that greater unity and therefore sense also of dynastic continuity within the national boundary, to sort of sum up all these dynastic inheritances. Incredibly complex games for which, again, the Habsburgs might not even rise in at some point for banal biological reasons. And that, however, was aimed at essentially establishing great part, even in that of the ancien regime, that especially in Central Europe, saw a more modest development, say, of the urban classes, a greater power of the nobility. This had been the case also in the same southeastern Germany. An affirmation of princes as leaders, right, in their own, at least, private possessions, that to some, in the case of the Habsburgs, would become the largest, in fact, in Germany, to a level of regional power, at the level of the great ones in Europe. And that I have also discussed, for example, in the video about the Landsknechts, because, as you know, those were created by Maximilian I in a sort of subversive way to, of course, be dramatically obedient to the empire, so to the Habsburgic cause. Read that, but also as a strong sort of popular force that in Germany that was somehow, like, that Northern Europe in the, say, compared to the South, rose faster in relative terms during the late Middle Ages, right? It arrived later in that regard. It had this sort of tail strikes. Also think about the German peasant revolt and so on. So before everything was completely brought down, together with the rest of Europe, basically under the Ancien Regime. And that was not a compliment to the elites, in the sense that those were also, generally speaking, weaker in Central Europe, less rich than elsewhere, but still, say, more exactly for this, having less also competitors in the lower ranks, right? So whenever there was some sort of uprising, whatever, this sort of at the end of the day unsuccessful chance of, say, of the peasantry to break free, to earn a representation in the country's estates, etc. The highest powers tend to be, so the most monarchic one tends to use this against the other nobility, which meant, from a Habsburgic perspective, the other nobility of the empire, that prevented the the Habsburgs to take over the entire country, which, as you know, would be the deal during the 30 Years' War, during even the same, still by the 19th century, there was an idea that the Habsburgs could be the ones who would unify Germany at some point. All this, as you understand, is an incredibly complicated game that you cannot simply say, well, because it worked in other countries as well. When you look again at England, France, and Spain, governing these countries was incredibly difficult as well. It was just easier than places like in Central Europe, but also brutally messed up in the first place, because all the world worked like that, right? So, yes, we tend to see in that sense, but those were the ones who more precociously arrived, where we arrived now. Yes, okay, but at the time, it was still, it's something you want to see now, right? At the time, they were making that effort because they understood civilizationally that it would have paid off, but they had still enormous difficulties to carry that out. So the sense of territorial continuity or rationalization or compaction of territories is, when you look at an Habsburgic imperial map, the first thing that you wonder. Like, why did it take that shape? Why can't I see anything similar to it on today's map of Europe anymore, and so on. So you have even there to make an effort, of course, understanding a bit how the empire specifically worked, how it had formed and why. I already gave you some hint. Again, I have a pretty hefty Holy Roman Empire playlist that you can browse. But we'll look here at the essentials for the sake of summary. Diplomacy, of course, was essential. You have this sort of very irregular picture, like why would it take that form again? It's obviously a product of a constant negotiation, right? Of there is also geography in it, right? It's not to say that geography does not affect politics, just it's somehow ludicrous to pretend that there can be something called like geopolitics, as if geography was essentially the single most important factor in the process. This is quite misleading, and it could be also part of the reason why you would pose such question. And everything was actually quite coherent considering the times and places, right? And you can yet see this continuous situation of balance of precarious say boundaries of sort of backs and forth. Again, everything that can change just for a single dynastic change, like it would happen for other countries, that you would see even more unitary, more coherent, also on a geographical basis, but that would, for example, end up under the Habsburgs later on. So the beginning of the Habsburgs, at least as far as the German royal crown is concerned, of course, starts with Rudolf I, 1273-91. Right? You can argue that this was still an imperial position, one of Roman kingship formally, right? So the king of the Romans was the would-be emperor, like the guy who was essentially chosen by the princes of the empire, not just as king of Germany, but as the guy would have to go to Rome to be crowned emperor by the Pope. Rudolf would never actually come to Italy, even though he planned multiple occasions to do so, because of all what was happening, right? Namely, trying to put an end to the interregnum and succeeding in that, and especially, however, dealing with the responsibility and the resistance that had procured. Rudolf had begun as the modest lord of the several modest-sized southwestern German territories, and he had actually been elected by the German princes for this reason. That is, they thought he was a man of integrity. He was respected. This this lineage had a reputation, but it was not particularly powerful. So the idea was, let's elect, again, as all the elective monarchies of Central Europe, let's elect somebody that is fundamentally weak, that we can use as our puppet, as princes, and let's erode further public authority, the one that all the German kings had tried with enormous difficulty to put together, right? And that was instead collapsed. In fact, Rudolf, just like even the last Swabians, had been struggling to, in part, of course, recover the lost imperial royal rights in Germany, but at the same time doing so from a very sound private asset that we will see now how it was built. This was true actually for all the German kings of the previous times, right? The Ottonians had lots of castles, as you know, in Saxony. There's a pattern there. Henry the Fowler building that for Otto I, the same, doing the father of Frederick Barbarossa in Swabia, etc. So there are always these privatistic mechanisms behind that in Germany, because Germany had never had anything public fundamentally in a institutional fashion, and so power rested mostly on brutal force, like pretty much everywhere, but without, in this case, much further glue to keep that together, also from an ideological point of view. Now, the interesting thing about what I was saying about before German identity that I forgot to finish is that there was a sense that Germans were Romans at the time. If you look at even the quite, local and beautiful, that's somehow the Austrian, the Styrian actually, Dante, Ottokar van der Gaal, in the Steirische Rheinchronik regarding the Battle of Markfeld and Rudolf's triumph against his opponents that would establish, in fact, the southeastern German principality that would be the power base of the Habsburgs. You hear this was the son of a ministerialis, right? So these were the iron arm of the German monarchs. That the Swabian, the Rudolf's troops' battle cry was, "Here is Rome," right? And you see, of course, in the official documents that these guys were called, like, we are kings of the Romans, we are the Romans, our Roman power. And this, especially during the 13th century, was strongly reinforced. This was going on since essentially the Ottonians, right? That literally switched, say, from German to Roman ethnicity institutionally, right? Under the Carolingians, yes, that was the Roman Empire, which was still intended as the empire of the Franks that had taken the Roman one. From Ottonian times, you have literally that the Saxon dynasty starts saying, we are Romans, right? We have a Saxon origin, but as emperors, we are Romans, because there is no other possible somatic possibility for being dynasts of the universal empire, but in Romanity, right? So this was deeply believed because, of course, after the end of the Roman Empire, nobody ever recreated anything so enormous. There was all the Christian providential meaning of it. The Germans, and I will make a video about this hopefully soon, had managed to wield again part of this power, but they still accepted the fact that without restoring the Roman Empire, this thing could have never even stepped further, right? And re-achieving what the golden era that had temporarily been repristinated throughout the various ages of the generation of mankind, according to the older prophecies under Augustus, and so on. And so this is the reason why they were so radically imbued with the sense of the literal Romanity of the empire. And this is essentially all what Habsburgic history has been, at least until the beginning of the 19th century, when the empire as the Holy Roman was no more, and so sad times began, really embodied. Right, the entire meaning of this dynasty rested on this. In the moment in which, of course, they had become themselves the same emperors and had managed, as we will see now, to secure this Roman power for themselves. Not immediately, not straight away from Rudolf, because as you know, there would be the Luxembourgs. I made a video about the fate of the empire between the Luxembourgs and the Habsburgs, etc. There were other figures here, the Wittelsbachs, etc. But that's where the Habsburgic power is settled in a regional sense as well. Right, the German princes had elected Rudolf, also backing him militarily, together with his Swabian retinues, to repel the threat posed by German eastern neighbors, that is Bohemia and Hungary, right? Especially the former, as you know, had created a vast potentate, a stretch, in fact, from Bohemia up to the Adriatic Sea, so controlling essentially southeastern Germany. We're talking about, of course, the Przemyslids of Ottokar II, that is killed, in fact, at the Battle of Markfeld in 1278 by a coalition, in fact, of Habsburgic, Swabian, in fact, Southeast German and Hungarian forces, right, to stop Bohemian power. At that point, actually, the German princes had stripped Rudolf of his of their help, right? Because he had already occupied southeastern Germany, and the final showdown with Ottokar, that had taken refuge in Bohemia, would occur 2 years later. So at that point, he literally risked to get killed himself in the battle, right? He almost was. But this victory basically changes everything, because the defeat, the minority of Ottokar's son, exposes Bohemia. Rudolf recompacts his control in southeastern Germany. He essentially establishes a protectorate over Bohemia. His son, in the following years, there is all a settling together with the other princes of the empire, recognizing Rudolf's sons at the head of Styria, Carinthia. He would be the Duke of Austria, and plus there are the southwestern German lands still owned, and much of them would remain in Habsburgic hands up to the rise of the Swiss Confederacy, that, as you know, was also exploiting the later split into the two branches of the Habsburgs. Rudolf's son at some point becomes also King of Poland, is recognized just namely so, but before the latter's death, you have really an enormous Habsburgic power. Rudolf destroyed as much as 70 castles in the Rhineland to curb the rebels in his attempt to restore properly an imperial public authority. At that point, it was too late, arguably, but let's say the initial drive, and even there, assassinations, other biological reasons, bring the Habsburgs to be countered eventually by the Luxembourgs. Bohemia calls this essentially French-speaking dynasty from the western fringes of the empire to rule in Prague, that would become the heart of 14th century Europe, and the Habsburgs would be temporarily ousted, also having suffered defeat at the hands of the Bavarians. So it's all history that we will look in depth another time. The most important aspect, though, we'll skip a lot of things, of course, is the sense that the southeastern German lands are consolidated. Again, I made a video about the Duchy of Austria, the one of Styria. We still have to talk about other parts of Germany that were all under the Habsburgs. But the consolidation of this regional sphere is established even under the different branches that, of course, create a condition of weakness. But especially Rudolf IV, that founded the University of Vienna and boosted somehow the sense of Habsburgic grandeur, is also the one who essentially elevated himself to the rank of Archduke. That is the title that would be maintained by the House of Habsburgs for Austria. That would remain as a launching pad for eventually resuming imperial throne, imperial control. And that was a response, by the way, to the settlement of the Golden Bull, that in that sense would never quite be significantly altered, that was brokered by the Luxembourgs in order to keep the Duchy of Austria out of the Great Electors. So making, at least officially and juridically, the Habsburgs, say, powerless as far as the voting system of the Holy Roman and in the election of the Holy Roman Emperor was concerned. Right, so it's remarkable eventually that, of course, the same Habsburgs would be voted by others as Holy Roman Emperors to the point of consolidating further their title. So this would come through a quite complex process that we will see surely at some other time. What I would like to stress is how much the Habsburgs in the 13th century established their strategic position in the Austrian lands by feeling as moral heirs to the Hohenstaufen. Right, this is deeply felt as such. It was really a different time, right? A great page in the book of history had been turned by these events. Paradoxically, it was the same Habsburgs who catalyzed this process, but the idea that the Romanity of the empire and the great myth of universal power would remain in the hands of this dynasty for essentially all the rest of their history, arguably even after the end of the Holy Roman Empire, was felt, of course, as an imposition there accepted by Europe, but that still the Habsburgic monarchy was carrying on as a sort of fact of genetic legacy in a, of course, ever more aging process. The succession of Emperor Albert II marks the step here. We're talking about 1438, 1440. There were other German princes, of course, competing for imperial power. This coming back also under Frederick III, 1440, 1493, was somehow random, somehow dictated also by other external factors on which the Habsburgs themselves depended, on matrimonial policies, on wars being fought in Central Europe between other kingdoms. So Austria at that point was not even particularly impressive as a power. But especially with Frederick III, that again is often credited as being an idler or a lazy guy because he wasn't much of a warrior and preferred diplomacy, there is on the contrary, a sense of, let's say, presumptuous yet prophetic boasting of Austrian ambitions that is quite famously displayed by the adoption of the all-vowel acronym AEIOU, which stands for Austria est imperare orbi universe. So Austria is destined to rule over the entire globe, right? Not bad as an agenda, I would say. And this could definitely not come but from such a illustrious dynasty as the one that was being also rebuilt in concrete power with the reunification of the two branches of the family and the gradual, recognition of the same power at that high level that the various Central European rulers had tried to develop by covering each other's back, right, and marrying to one another, etc. Now of course, the Luxembourgs go extinct, the Wittelsbachs somehow keep lagging behind. There are also other important houses, such as the Wetten one, the Hohenzollern, that was also Swabian in origin, like the Hohenstaufen and the Habsburgs. Swabia, in this sense, in spite of the fact that it would at that point not be much more of an important land anymore, like it wouldn't be a great power with great Swabian power historically emerging, it was always felt also in German nationalism during the struggle for unification, etc., as the most important, the truly most German and powerful and illustrious and truly dignified of the various lines, as a sort of course, of great respect towards the Hohenstaufen. Right today, I've been talking with Swabian neighbors, and I don't want to to tell you what they told me about them, because they don't pass for the same reputation, but that's just sort of localistic rivalries, I guess. They happen really everywhere, but it's somehow still moving that the Habsburgs, that did maintain some lands, by the way, in their ancestral abodes, that were very much also projected towards the Franco-Burgundian world, would be maintained as a truly heartly European dimension that the Habsburgs definitely embodied and kept defending, again in imperial universal sense, later on against national ambitions that were instead to disgregate the same unity of Christendom. Again, as we were saying before, just think about France supporting the Ottomans or the Protestants in Germany, and the Habsburgs having to cope with that. The Central European location here had its own advantage to some degree, considering, of course, not much the geography of it, but the surroundings politically. And as we'll see, in fact, that Germany doesn't quite have an eastern border, right? It's all open towards a broader, Central Eastern European dimension. There is an Habsburgic spread across the Alps, with, of course, the intention of hegemonizing Italy, repristinating the imperial control on the Italic kingdom. You have, as we will see now, so notoriously this sort of projection towards the west, mostly because of the Burgundian inheritance, and again, importantly enough, this very fragmented Germany that allows for some further propagation of what was just the right of the emperors. Right here, we're not talking Hungary, for example, that would become a sort of land of conquest, split, with the Ottomans that were far stretched in the northwest. The creation of Royal Hungary, essentially 1/3 of the country, etc., and the Habsburgs, etc. So there are many options, lots of options, as a matter of fact, and sort of common interests between different players around. You have Poland that would remain Catholic, for example. You have still the papal element in Italy. Then the Spanish connection would reinforce further of course, the confessional exchequer in the modern age. In any case, these factors would start being more evident only when the Habsburgic monarchy emerged suddenly, in a sense, as a dynasty on the European stage at somehow the end of the 15th century. So at this point, this southeastern regional power was important, right? It had properly a sound political territorial base of regional dimension. It could levy substantial armies updated to the Swiss model, with, in fact, the Landsknechts essentially created in this bitter rivalry that existed between the Habsburgs and the Swiss Confederacy that had kicked them out, the former out of their most of their ancestral lands. So the big deal is, of course, Frederick III's remarkable son, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, 1493-1519, who was responsible for the conclusion and fruition, also after his death, because of what he had said diplomatically, of 3 key marriage alliances. The dates fundamentally span from 1477 to 1526. Right. So the first union was the same Maximilian's marriage, famously enough, with the daughter and heiress of the Duke of Burgundy. Right. We're talking about Mary of Valois-Burgundy, with the then young Maximilian of Habsburg, that, by the way, inspired the famous refrain, Bella gerent ali, tu Felix Austria nube, namque Mars alis dat tibi regna Venus, which is the extraordinary let others, fight wars. You, happy Austria, marry. Right? What Mars bestows on others, Venus gives to you. And I can't hide that whenever I visit the Hofburg, the Belvedere, Schönbrunn, etc., I often tell this within myself repeatedly, because it's just beautiful, poetic, it's a joyful, loving, right? A triumph of love, and this, I don't know how much also of the Julian inheritance, right, from the descendant from Venus and Mars, of course, in part, to Maximilian was a fighter himself, was a soldier. He was even serving together with his Landsknechts, parading on foot sometimes, and with them he was credited with the creation properly of the Maximilian type of armor, etc. So even in here you have a Roman imperial legacy based on this genetic output, the sense that, of course, the most important traditional purpose is spreading, right, your genes, creating more life, more love, more power, right? And the Habsburgs definitely were very prolific throughout all their history, so that they could play with these marriage alliances, who provided them with a shocking amount of international power. Admittedly, they were lucky. Things could go differently. The Felix Austria nube was, by the way, coined by the very humanistic-minded Hungarian king, Matthias Corvinus. I made a video about him last winter, 1458, 1490, one of the greatest rulers in the history of the country, after which basically Hungary began its decline. When his ruler had done everything to keep things together, because privatization there had brought to the oligarchs essentially to dismantle the country in the same way. And the reason why Matthias composed these verses was that he could appreciate his Habsburgs rivals' good fortune, by the way, which was somehow still, say, a mockery, because of course the reference to Mars there is also the to leave war to others, is of course to the fact that the same Matthias had marched on the Habsburgic capital of Vienna. Capital is a big word, right, for medieval times, especially in Central Europe, but de facto, like, that's what Vienna would remain as the most important center and the seat of, say, the most important seat of the Habsburgic court. We're talking about 1485 at the time of Maximilian's father. So now the prince's success with his Burgundian marriage was changing lots of things everywhere in Europe. There was a further mockery which brought to a different version of the AEIOU that was allererst ist Österreich verloren. That is to say, first of all, Austria has lost everything, referring to the aforementioned March of the Black Army on Vienna, right? However, 5 years later, there wasn't much to laugh from the Hungarian side, because in fact Matthias' empire fell apart as he died childless, right? So power has to substantiate also in a sort of progeny, and which Maximilian and Mary would definitely produce, with a major political and territorial change in Europe. Because, as you know, while never made a video about the entirety of the Burgundian state, made one about the Duchy of Burgundy, but of course the history is notorious, and I also discuss it in that video. And I explained this in that one about Louis XI. When Mary's father, Charles the Bold, died in battle against the Swiss Confederacy after, a disastrous trio of Burgundian defeats against the Confederates that literally destroyed what was considered as the single most chivalric, prestigious, and somehow prosper country in Europe. It's really overstated, telling the truth. I have my own opinions about Burgundy specifically. Of course, Mary was the only heiress. Other problem of lack of a male heir by Charles. So what was brokered was this marriage between the Valois Burgundy and the Habsburgs, which brought, however, just a part of the Burgundian state, namely the Low Countries, in Habsburgic hands, because the French actually decided to occupy Burgundy, the duchy, so the continental part roughly. This is quite interesting because Louis XI basically chose the military way, but they could have simply actually married Mary with the French, right? And there would have been likely something similar to what happened with Brittany, right? It was only later absorbed formally by just osmosis and this partial, connection with France, because in theory those were, even when the various heiresses, such as Anne of Bretagne, married with the French kings, still they would maintain properly the property of Brittany, and just with later mechanisms the land would become annexed to the Kingdom of France. But at that point in French history, that would have opened to, maybe as it happened with the same Brittany, generations before the Burgundian affair could be settled. So the French thought to simply occupy Burgundy. That was from there on essentially in the hands of the French. Yes, during the Italian wars, especially after Pavia, there were promises to Charles V that claimed this land as an inheritance, in fact, from his grandparents, from his grandmother, Mary specifically. No actual control of the Habsburgs that didn't have the capacity to do so, especially from Germany, of this land. The Low Countries, as you know, were very rich. They had developed a sense of national identity under the same Valois-Burgundian administration that had basically conquered these lands after, still the Flemish had kept out the French at Courtrai, but technically the Burgundians were the Saints. They just took over the land in the late Middle Ages. But they were far away. They're diametrically opposite to Austria in the Kingdom of Germany from a geographical point of view. And Maximilian manages to win Guinegate, sort of reforming the local Flemish forces on the base of through Swiss contractors, but he doesn't manage to centralize this place. The Dutch didn't give a damn about the Austrians. They hated them as much as they could have hated the Spanish, and generally speaking, they were playing on this of course, the centralized card that they could afford. However, still, the Habsburgs had gained through Maximilian and Mary's marriage this dramatic amount of land that they partially controlled, that they partially drew their forces from, allowing the Habsburgic monarchy to step further, like on the international scene, right? The most important marriage, however, was definitely the Spanish one, right? This next great match transformed the Habsburgs as a dynasty truly into a world power. Of course, you know the story. When Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile agreed to wed their daughter Joanna to Maximilian's son Philip, known as the Fair or the Handsome, in 1496, they had no expectation that the Habsburgs would, by the way, soon inherit the new Spanish Empire that they themselves had done so much to create, albeit maintaining always, again, the two crowns really distinct, divided from an institutional point of view. Again, it's just a dynastic sum of possessions. And the reason why they didn't believe this is that there were lots of other heirs before Joanna to the Spanish thrones. 5, as a matter of fact, which all died. Right. So what happened is that Philip, the son of Maximilian and Mary, became Philip I of Spain, as essentially the husband to the heiress of the Spanish thrones, Joanna. You know, their story is pretty weird. Philip died young. Joanna was a bit weird mentally. You have to understand a bit the background there. Just know that, you know, when she was foolishly in love and jealous of Philip, so that when he died, she went around the country always close to his coffin that she brought, and she opened regularly to look at him. So Juana la Loca in Spanish says Joanna the crazy, like, as eventually she would be essentially relegated in de facto prison, and is one of the darkest pictures in here. This, however, wouldn't happen before, of course, Philip and Joanna had lots of children, as a matter of fact, including Charles, the future Charles V, that was born in 1500. So he would have to wait 1519 to become himself emperor, as his father had actually died, and the emperor had always remained all along his grandfather Maximilian, from whom he learned a lot, and he barely knew. He was raised by his aunt in Flanders, by the way, so he barely ever met with his mother. Charles was essentially a true a Burgundian knight. Like, of all the various cultural, national influences that he had, of course, he spoke all languages. There is a phrase, something like, I speak French to men, Italian to women, and German to my horse, like to stress a bit the multinational character of his empire. But he was born and raised in Ghent, in Flanders, and remember, these were failing themselves. He belonged from his grandmother's side to a Valois, Burgundian rule of the Flemish, right? So while he was in theory like Flemish-born, he was actually a Burgundian, a French knight, right? But specifically Burgundian, and the grandeur of that great, in fact, forgive the word repetition, court, right, of the greatest leaders of the Crusades against the Turks, of the the establishers of the Golden Fleece Order, etc. So the cream of the cream of European nobility, and he took on essentially mostly that he received by education, that kind of background, right? So Charles would inherit Castile and Aragon from his mother, Burgundy, including the Netherlands, and the dynasty's German lands through his father. Charles, after a bitter competition with Francis I of France, was elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1519. Yes, the King of France could become Holy Roman Emperor, right? He just wouldn't pay enough, like the Fugger there helped, of course, the Habsburgs a bit. There were other issues, actually. It was a very complicated story. But that's how he succeeded his grandfather Maximilian as Emperor Charles V, 1519-1556. This dynastic sum was incredible, stupendous, enormous, of global scale, literally. So the idea of the empire where the sun never sets, as the New World had been discovered, and the Spanish were extending far beyond the European domination. An incredible, stupendous, enormous dynastic coup, far beyond the bitter expectations of Matthias Corvinus. So these marriages, the Burgundian and the Spanish ones, were really the most significant, and as far as especially the universal side of the story was concerned, because of course the impression also with the contemporaries, and especially from the French that found themselves in between the major chunks of the Habsburgic dynasty, that at that point was still one, even though of course Charles was already delegating much of his power, especially in Central Europe, to his brother, seemed really the chance to re-establish the true universal rule over the entire Europe, right? Through the sense that the Holy Roman Emperor should have consolidated under his hegemony, like power over Europe, the Mediterranean, crush the Turk, that now was becoming quite an issue, etc. Right. So you have Spain, the Low Countries, also what were the Aragonese extensive Italian possessions, as we said, Castile, yes, emerging new world empire. So it was evident there that, of course, the most important part of such dynastic possessions was the Western European one. Spain was by far the biggest chunk, the most powerful one. The Iberian monarchies were far more resourceful than what essentially the Habsburgic Austrian state was, and it offered much greater opportunities. The same reason why Charles would confer, also because of his love for Flanders, as you understand from before, the Netherlands to his son and heir Philip II as King of Spain, but not Holy Roman Emperor, title which would pass to the line of Charles' brother Ferdinand. So this is obvious, right? Always consider this, that dynastically speaking, it was the most sensible thing to do, at least to, of course, see in Spain the greatest center of power. It was just self-evident, obvious. It had Naples, Sicily, the Milan, like it did. At least, there were, of course, the Italian wars that were being fought over this against the French, with the Ottoman threat always looming etc. But, right, the sense is that, of course, this was by far the most important theater or set of theaters, and the Austrian lands were ceded by Charles to his younger brother Ferdinand. Just in practice, then eventually, of course, throughout all his life, Charles was Holy Roman Emperor and Archduke of Austria, etc. But it was a family business, right? And the Habsburgs were quite close-knit clan, we can say. There would be lots of considerations regarding the sort of even complex that the Habsburgs had at that point towards other more affirmed dynasties, or at least monarchies that had been more continuous and far-reaching. I mean, the French one was already just more important from Capetian times, with a much greater regional continuity and sort of also hegemonic aims than the Habsburgs had been, as they were, as you understand, being catapulted to a much greater dimension from, say, not really from a day to another, but almost really in generational times. And the Austrian Habsburgs would always suffer a bit of this. The fact that they were, generally speaking, poorer than other great monarchies. The fact that they didn't have, for example, saints in the family, as other monarchies instead had. And so they compensated, they sort of exploited both things to say, okay, we are poorer, at least than others. Let's make our court a bit more, austere, sort of Spartan, etc. There was a bit of counter-reformistic influence from Spain there that was naturally very influential in also the German lands of the Habsburgs. We observed this in many ways. The same Landsknecht's dress fashion was from the dominant Spanish military at the time, etc. But it was exactly what I was saying at the beginning about this combination, this compromise, this balance between modernity and tradition, right? The fact that the Habsburgs incarnated the Holy Roman imperial power, but were also projected on especially under Charles V, to a very sort of exotic dimension across the world, literally. And so it's just a great story, also a family history, as we were pointing out before, and I hope we'll do it a bit more in depth, right? But speaking of the third marriage, that also was very important, especially for Central European affairs to come, was the one involving Ferdinand in Hungary, right? This was a truly bizarre mechanism, as we explain now, because in 1506, Maximilian and the Jagiellon king Ladislas II of Hungary and Bohemia, remember these sort of dynastic sums of different kingdoms for which I rule from one and I will take a little bit from the other because they're just the nobles elected me for not being so oppressive, and so I will try to centralize with that little surplus a bit more in this other country mechanisms like this, concluded a highly speculative accord, right? To tell you sometimes how desperate these rulers really were, that foreshadowed essentially a double marriage of Ferdinand to Ladislas' daughter Anna, and of Ferdinand's infant sister Mary to the as yet unborn but hopefully male, so they didn't know, of course, before birth at the time, even the sex of the child of Ladislas' pregnant wife. This is weird because, just imagine a daughter had been born. Well, instead a male was born. That would be also an important figure, even though a tragic one, and also for his own country, that is Louis II. In fact, Ladislas' son and successor, and heir, which enabled, by the way, both marriages to be celebrated following the conclusion of a more definite wedding compact in 1515. When the childless King Louis II died at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, fighting the Ottoman Turks, his Habsburg widow Mary and brother-in-law Ferdinand were able to secure the latter's election as King of Hungary and Bohemia. And this is how basically the Habsburgic control over at least what remained of Hungary and Bohemia still set as a whole, as a decayed monarchy, because after the Luxembourgs and especially the Hussite wars, the country had gone devastated, and so it lost much of its previous power. But it was still tidy, unitary, compact. Hungary was much more messed up, and if anything, because it was a sort of empire, again, ruled by oligarchs more than anything, right? Well, Bohemia was also just next door to Austria in a more contiguous way and without too many external pressures. Yes, there were issues with Poland. Silesia was contended, but say this is just for saying that, of course, everything was a mess all the time. Let's say these were the least important problems. So this opens, of course, to the Habsburgic control, especially of Bohemia, which is a large chunk, but also the very torn issue of Hungary. That, as you know, until the late 17th century, the beginning of the 18th, wouldn't quite be controlled to not even the majority by the Habsburgs, as the Ottomans fundamentally controlled more of it, at least. It was essentially divided in three areas. Like the one in half was a sort of bit of a proxy area, like the other was more stable in Ottoman hands. But I made lots of videos about especially 17th century Hungarian issues, and we will have to talk especially about the 16th one. So you understand that the great artifacts behind all these incredibly fortuitous unions was Maximilian I, right? As frenetically matchmaking as you can think, and far-sighted, by the way, who, in fact, actually planned and concluded numerous other, yet in this case less fruitful marriage alliances during his lifetime, right? That's where Matthias Corvinus had come from with the entire story of the little poem. The question is, at least posed by someone in general, that gets curious about how did the Habsburgs rise so much in power, right? Is how did it happen? I mean, why did these other players give so much credit to the Habsburgs? Right, so of course the answer lays, we can't see marriage by marriage now, but in some sort of accidents sometimes, so if opportunities would arise, however, mostly all the time. You had some major powers emerging in Europe, and Austria is actually one of them overall, yet it's not such a dangerous one. It's, again, a Central European power, and normally in that area there aren't powers that can, for example, venture in maritime ambitions. That's a quite interesting perspective if you think about that. That's also why the Spanish dominions are maintained intact, not under, let's say, a German control, for example, in Italy. There is a truly Central European dimension that has to cope with and has to balance, for example, just think about the Ottoman expansion, right, that after Hungary was crushed, which is something that the Habsburgs were even, say, not maybe looking forward to, but still they had always been felt threatened by Hungary and vice versa, so that the question there was also, it happened, and it's a bit like the French support to the Turks. Like, it wasn't because the French were sadist anti-Christians. They realized that it was in their national interest in that case to act like that when they were under not for anything, but just because they were under siege at a point, under significant pressure. They had a lot of forces to spend also, and this would bring them unavoidably against some Habsburgic possessions. The Burgundian marriage was, of course, aside from what the French monarchy decided, an anti-French stand of the Habsburgs. Given that, by the way, Charles the Bold was killed just 3 months before the same wedding of his daughter. So everything was rushed, right, in that sense, because the idea is that two powerful Frances could inherit even the Low Countries, and finally reconnect Burgundy to the French crown would have been an enormous problem for anybody involved, and lots of powers in England, in Spain, in Italy were worried of the French, and everybody knew that after the end of the 100 Years' War, France was just recompacting, reuniting, and that they would have likely, as they did, invaded Italy and threatened there lots of interests of other countries, including the Spanish, the imperial ones, and so on. So this all is to be seen again step by step, depending on the various rivalries, even among the even small seigneuries that would, however, be the tip of the balance in this great, truly European game. Right, we are in the Renaissance. Europe is truly becoming one in terms of a circle of as a political environment, as a sort of renewed universal space, even not for the best reasons or the right directions. The Reformation was behind the corner. There were huge issues with the Ottomans. So also all these machinations reflect what was criticized by the moralists of the time. Like, we are killing each other as Christians while the Turks are basically swarming in the Balkans, in Central Europe. They're threatening the northern Mediterranean shores, etc. So it's gonna be a freaking mess, right? The union with Spain, for example, stemmed from Ferdinand of Aragon's desire to protect his own dynasty's possessions in Italy, following France's sensational conquest of the peninsula under Charles VIII in 1494, which was temporary. But, as you know, the French essentially claimed dynastically, and they weren't even wrong about that. If you look at the marriage with the Visconti and the fact that there had been the Angevins in southern Italy, the control of Milan and Naples, right? That's basically what also Charles VIII showed, is that the French could, other than just wanted to do so, and everything was, Charles VIII said, we're doing this because from Italy we want to launch a crusade to recover Jerusalem from the Ottomans. But it was evidently just a great issue. It was demonstrating, by the way, something that up to that point, until the French didn't try first, was just invading a country which nobody knew what kind of resistance would have put up, because the Italian states altogether were, if united, would have been actually stronger than any other of these monarchies, except they weren't, right? Because they had their own separate interests, didn't have much of a vision, and so the political crisis that followed would have just opened to another phase, in fact, in modern history altogether, right? There was also an English connection, right? The two subsequent Anglo-Spanish marriage alliances were motivated by England's historic rivalry with France. Right, the English didn't, after the 100 Years' War, tried to invade France once again. Right, it wasn't over that much, and I'm talking just literally about the next few decades. Right, and again, it's all much more messed up than it sounds. Made multiple videos also about Wars of the Roses that were connected with this, also French interference, as you know. In any case, Burgundy, Spain, and England envisioned the French as a threat to their to their stability, right? At least there's a balance of power in Western Europe. France was unitarily speaking the single most powerful country, right? Spain didn't kid either, but it also had to cope, in fact, with the Ottomans in the Mediterranean. So France was instead just this hugely compact landmass that could now threaten to simply make of the Italian peninsula just as an appendix of itself. And this would have created enormous issues, especially for the imperial rights in the Italian kingdom and just the Spanish influence in the Western Mediterranean, etc. There was naturally, I plan to make a video on the Italian wars soon because we never did it, and very often that series of wars is misunderstood in the essence of it and what was essentially being tried there, which the final settlement of Cateau-Cambrésis somehow exemplifies, where there's sort of balanced position after all, in spite of the ultimate French defeat, right? The Jagiellon kings of Hungary and Bohemia and the noble diets that subsequently elected Ferdinand, remember that there were elective monarchies calling this guy from outside that would have not been there all the time, or even most of the time, to succeed them as king, were driven by the need to, of course, enlist Habsburg assistance against the Ottoman Turks. Right? Bohemia had been worried about that. Austria was even more exposed. But of course, the Hungarians were the most freaky there because they were just the next target were fighting from a long time against the Ottomans. And their country was actually falling apart, mostly because of the internal issues. Than an actually Ottoman superpower, even though it was definitely a remarkable one. So, indeed, consider this, that the Ottomans, for example, had a much more unitary power. They had more succession issues overall, but Machiavelli, famously enough, exemplifying this, comparing the empire with the Ottoman Empire with the French monarchy, was instead a very feudal thing with many heads, right? Even if the king had been killed, instead, if the Ottoman Sultan of Constantinople had been taken, the Ottoman Empire would have simply disappeared. Now, indeed, such sense of urgency for Hungary was not lost on the entourage of the ill-fated Louis II. That, as you know, wasn't quite successful at the end of the day. And March was a tragedy of enormous proportions for Europe as well, at least, and especially for the Hungarians, of course, that for hundreds of years would have seen their land torn apart between two sides, and then eventually awaiting other centuries for gaining independence once again. In a completely different scenario, right? That had somehow, in fact, subordinated them to Habsburgic power that had emerged as a completely different thing. So, to answer the aforementioned question, that is why so many partners for Austria, well, it's something we hinted at already. The Habsburgs were not particularly threatening for all those with whom these alliances were established, right? The Maximilian and his successors were sensitive to the emergence of aggressive states all along the fringes of Germany, whether in the west in France, to the south in Italy, or to the east in the Balkans. So the idea is that they were interested in supporting the powers that would have had to deal with this with these threats by essentially either taking control of these frontier areas or supporting other powers or receiving support from them, as they weren't able, as the Habsburgic Empire would have managed to do. Essentially, they didn't have colonies. Yes, they had some, commercial company from the Habsburgic Netherlands, etc. But as you know, the Habsburgic Empire was in many ways also technologically backwards, even when military powerful. Never confuse the two things, by the way, because they don't necessarily overlap. They had a truly more traditional outlook because they hadn't known the complications of administering a global empire, right? They had developed this sort of very different negotiation necessities with various communities that were under their protection, as a matter of fact, against other threatening powers. And this method still is helped both internally and externally to preserve Habsburgic power. That, again, especially in the second half of the 16th century, it was not even that enormous thing, right? There were ups and downs in Habsburgic history in terms of power or relevance, etc., right? You have this great exploit at the beginning of the 30 Years' War, for which they actually win. They managed to unify Germany, and then the tides are turned, and they actually lose the war. Then, however, they're about to be crushed by the Ottomans, with that essentially attempted twice, and on other occasions could have simply marched on Vienna, right? And actually they crush the Turks in 1683, also with external support, as you know, and they managed to establish themselves as a major power in Central Europe by seizing large swaths of land from the Ottomans and affirming themselves in a very robust position for a consistent century, and another one with the Napoleonic crisis in between. So it's a very delicate balance. You can't quite see the Habsburgic Empire like you say. Well, also France at some point was to collapse, right? There were moments in which truly the system could be broken. But at least it was still France, and every time it was unified, it was a hell of a power, just because it had always been France. In many ways, the same Spain took that pattern, the same England, even though it was a smaller power, especially at this point after the 100 Years' War, somehow lagging behind continental developments. They were still a unitary monarchy. They had a national background that confers this kind of institutional homogeneity and more. The Habsburgs had always instead, in Austria, in Central Europe, to maintain this empire with means that were practically unique in their own regard. Right? While it is true that Germany was an elective monarchy, it was something completely different under so many points of view from all the other Central European monarchies. It was also German, while the others were essentially Slavic or Slavicized ones, and there were huge differences in that regard. Germany itself was a sort of bridge between tradition and modernity. It was not as, let's say, institutionally compact and statally advanced like the Western European monarchies, but it was very technologically advanced and very populous, right? And even though it was that fragmented and thus vulnerable, it still maintained essentially like a huge blob. De facto independence. Nobody really, aside from the multiple interference, really planned to say conquer the land like I don't know, the Habsburgs could do, at least keeping under their control places like Hungary, or I don't know, like the Prussians could do later with Poland, etc. So these of course are general considerations that I make as we're just introducing the topic. It goes without saying that the sum of Habsburgic dynastic possessions, especially in the early 16th century, as impressive as it was, did show this fragmentation, right? The sense that there were very different lands in many ways, even though there were Habsburgs in Germany as in Spain. The two lands didn't really have much to do with one another. They were, however, kept together by a common fear of two major powers there that were allied in this sense against the Habsburgs, in fact, the French and the Turks. So if you look at, for example, Spanish or Austrian policies at this point, as far as the priorities to pursue strategically against these threats, it's obvious that Spain pursued mostly its own interests and Austria its own, right? So they were still separated. They were still behaving as different systems. It was not like an Habsburgic empire where literally you think that, I don't know, Spain or Austria are thinking themselves under an Habsburgic empire. There's no such thing. There is just the Holy Roman Empire from one side, there is Spain from the other. They happen to have the same dynasty on their thrones, with different people, of course, especially in terms of who would control the land there, who would administer it, govern it locally. And yes, there is a sense of cooperation, there is a sense of course, of familiar connection, but the same, Charles V with Ferdinand I, well, they often played differently, right? And this was normal because also these rulers were essentially working to remain on the throne. Like a Renaissance ruler, doesn't matter how powerful, is always at enormous risk of his life, of the stability of his government. There are lots of revolts, there are lots of issues. Think about, again, not just the Protestant Reformation, but think about the problem of the Muslims in Spain. Still, where at some point, like there had been major expulsions, there had been the Limpieza de Sangre edict and all this stuff, but there were still huge amounts of them, and they would support the Ottoman raids on the Spanish coast. There were, let's say, it was a much more unregulated world than we think, in many ways, especially these large powers, these large sums of forces, etc. Very often, as we've saw through the marriage alliance, were desperate attempts to just becoming more powerful, but not immediately to secure, to consolidate, to compact the individual power locally. Right? In the case especially of Central Europe, was saying, okay, I'll become king of 4 different countries, but obviously I will rule just from one, and the other, who cares? Like, let them being devoured by the oligarchs as far as I'm in charge here, and people didn't live very long. I will, for now, invest here, right? It was also a sensible strategy, by the way, because everything was so unpredictable that that was somehow the safest thing to do, the most rational thing to do. So in other words, keeping in mind Machiavelli's famous dictum that one should always ally with the weaker powers against stronger ones, the Habsburgs were facilitated in their Central European government by the sense that there were bigger threats than they could be. Right? It may seem, like must a critique to their power. In a sense it is, right? The intrinsic mechanism still feudal Germany that the Habsburgs were trying to surpass with some sort of more centralized tribunals, like always considering this enormously intricated estates, prerogatives, and difficulty managing territory. It was an incredibly gradual yet relentless mechanism that would cement a sort of very different way of politics than other countries. Consider for a moment also this. Germany was huge overall, right? So the emperor as such could draw a lot from those that broader net, right? Could fish really lots of stuff. This is true for Italy too, for example, even though when we look at the Habsburg monarchy at this point, right, especially during the Renaissance, the Germans left the palm to the Spanish, because still they pursued again the same interests, and they weren't losing much from that. But the stability of Austrian power specifically was resting on the capacity to aggregate, to somehow bring under protection, to show that this universal, traditional imperial institution was something that was inherently different from the most centralizing sort of national statehood that was emerging prepotently in countries, especially like France, etc. And that overall was very, loose for, of course, today's standards in those countries as well. So there is definitely an enormous, even dysfunctionality at some point of this mechanism. Especially the Protestant Reformation threw everything to the bin, largely, because if that had been the case, the Habsburgs may have objectively consolidated a much greater power. It could have unified Germany way before, right? And the Reformation could be avoided, at least technically in the way it happened, also in a much easier way than one normally thinks. But it's exactly the intrinsic frailty of those institutions, especially in Central Europe, that allowed that to happen, as it had happened, for example, in Bohemia. You can argue that the greatest legacy that the Hussites left was actually the germ of rebellism among, say, within Germany, because of all the various Hussite exiles and refugees in the West that would fuel Protestant, say, modus operandi, right? In Germany, think about, again, all the wars that St. Charles V had to fight in Germany for this issue, as essentially all the prerogatives that the various German princes were being defended could be boosted by this new sense of, it's a matter of conscience, and I will essentially side against you as the most Catholic lay authority, just to to escape your pressure, even though I don't even believe in Luther or Calvinus, etc. So this, of course, is a bit the leitmotif, and I really want to talk especially about the German Peasant War, because it's also, from a military point of view, quite fascinating. It was truly a world upside down. In many ways, we've seen how, the imperial troops of Charles V mutinied and sacked Rome, right? As there were plenty of Lutherans among even the faithful Landsknechts, right? But also the fact that apparently the most violent and vicious looters and rapers and killers were the most Catholic Spanish in the same army in that horrible 1527. So you may want to appreciate how far from any kind of stability this world really was, and especially the fact that people at the time thought this of the Renaissance. We think of the Renaissance that it was such a great period. The people who lived in it specifically thought it was a horrible period. I mean, much worse than other times before, right? They literally realized and acknowledged this, because, of course, tragedies that were lamented through hyperbole existed throughout all history, but truly the metaphysical shock that the Reformation brought was something that made people lose the sense of almost everything at the time, and not much has been recovered, frankly, ever after that. On the contrary, things kept getting worse throughout the whole time, and in a sense, the fall of the Habsburgs later on was also the sum of all these shocks, right? So you want to appreciate the gigantic effort considering especially how the limited means at disposal that the Austrian Habsburgs carried out at that point. So much so that the empire would last in different forms until 1918. And that's also something you want to appreciate. And when you look at history, you realize that great empires lasted for a much greater time the older they were. And especially with different, of course, levels of achievement in a way. But let's say the less traditional, the shorter lasting in terms of political power. And this makes you look at the Habsburgic monarchy as something instead incredibly long after all. In a world like even the 20th century as it arrived to, compared in fact to lots of other powers, rose and fell, and that also that instead had much a smaller cycle. You can argue that, of course, there were so many. If you pick France or England, etc., you would think, well, these lasted also from before the Habsburgic Empire. That's fair. In fact, they were something very different from that. But again, they sided much earlier than Austria with a less traditional belief. Remember that I have a huge respect for especially countries like Britain and France, because in my opinion it really embodied from a European standpoint the greatest civilizational achievements. And of course this was done as a price of secularization and modernization, but at the same time what was good in them and their power, their colonial empires, etc., were stemmed from an incredible sense of tradition, after all, that could be missed as far as they were just functional units in their own within their own national boundaries. But this doesn't mean that their achievement could not be declined in a different way, for example, in a Central European context like the Habsburgs really did. So definitely in Europe, it's very difficult to pick a country that at some point didn't have a moment of global heyday of some sort, right? If you think about almost all European countries had their moment of utmost glory. Well, you want to appreciate that even today small Austria has much of a greater past than many larger countries, right, in Europe, and this should make us reflect on also the energies spent and the outcomes and how things transform in history, for which reason. Not just thinking it was somebody else's fault, but looking at what you are and realizing why did this happen to you, because that's also something that we go by every day ourselves. So there is really a lot of thoughts we could digress on, and I'll tell you what, in conclusion, that I was thinking today about it's a type of video that would introduce more generically why would I talk about the Habsburgic Empire. But I decided to skip it because I thought that it's better to watch this along the way, right, and formulating it together much better than I can do at the beginning, even though I do have very specific ideas about that, right? And the more we progress also in time, the more you realize how relevant this is for our contemporary reality, because essentially just a bit more than 1 century ago the Habsburgic Empire was still there, and lots of our history of culture and even familiar memory is connected with some of these things that, were in another, right? Sometimes also in a sort of, for example, independentistic sense against the Habsburgs, but definitely still in a moment in which we were part of it, and one must understand why. and the nationalistic card that opens straight to socialism and communism, because that's the degeneration, how it happens. Always remember that nationalism is born as a purely radical, extremistic, leftistic, terroristic ideology that is purely anti-traditional. And of course, fourth estate are derived, born and bred, right? So there is nothing to be proud of nationalism, right? Love for one's nation is not nationalism. Nationalism, as much as socialism, communism, is a religion for lesser human beings. And I think that studying Habsburgic history is also one of the great ways to demonstrate that there is a much tougher and incredibly more effective and pugnacious and honorable meaning in an empire like the Habsburgic one than in anything that all these ideologies have ever done. But by far, like not even a minimal part, right? So the idea that this is an interesting topic, of course, resonates, because it seems to me that all the debates around the Habsburgic Empire, especially pre-World War I Europe, revolve still on bases that have nothing to do with the ones that existed at the time. Nor in a way, nor in another. Right, and so since we make history here, you can't quite do it thinking otherwise, and that's my opinion. Not the best explanation. Trends are trends, but single, say, categorization, conceptualization that didn't even exist at the time, in a world that is literally forgetting in an accelerating way anything about the value of the sacred, for example, is completely useless, and it's one of just of the means of evil to essentially decerebrate people into making them think that they have any historical literacy, while as a matter of fact doesn't have any meaning. Right. Alright, well, for today, however, I stop it here. We'll keep talking about Habsburgic history, hopefully soon. If you enjoyed this video, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.